There's a sound an engine makes when it's running the wrong way that most people will never notice, because the human ear expects a rhythm, not a direction. And as long as the rhythm sounds steady and confident, most folks assume everything underneath it is exactly as it should be. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else, because it's the whole reason a family in the hill country of eastern Ohio spent 30 years listening to a machine breathe backward, without a single one of them ever knowing it. The call came from a man named Wendell, though it was really his mother, Opal, who wanted the machine looked at. Opal was pushing 90, sharp as a tack, and she'd inherited a stationary diesel power unit from her own father back in the 1950s, the kind of squat, heavy, single-cylinder engine that used to run water pumps, feed grinders, and sawmills before rural electrification finally reached that ridge. It still ran. That was the strange part. It had run, faithfully, every single time somebody needed it for over 70 years. But Wendell told me something on the phone that made the hair stand up on my arms before I'd even seen a photograph. He said his grandfather used to warn everybody every single time before starting it, "Stand clear of the flywheel side because she kicks the wrong way." Wendell had grown up hearing that phrase so many times it had become a kind of family scripture, repeated without anyone ever really asking what it meant. His father had said it. He said it himself now to his own grandkids. Nobody in 3 generations had ever stopped to wonder why a perfectly functioning engine would need a specific warning like that, passed down like a piece of dangerous folklore nobody dared question. I've learned over the years that families hand down warnings the way they hand down recipes. The instructions survive long after anybody remembers why they matter, and sometimes the why is the most interesting ingredient of all. I drove out there on a gray morning in early spring, the kind of morning where the mist still clings to the low pasture, and the air smells like wet limestone and last year's hay gone soft with rot. Gravel popped under my tires the last half mile, past a mailbox leaning at an angle that suggested at least one bad winter's worth of snowplow damage, and past a row of fence posts silvered with age, strung with wire gone slack in places where the staples had rusted loose. The engine sat in a lean-to shed attached to the side of an old dairy barn, mounted on a concrete pad that had been poured, I'd guess, sometime around the Truman administration, cracked now into a dozen irregular plates like the shell of something that had hatched a long time ago. The paint had gone the color of a robin's egg left too long in the weather, a soft, chalky blue-gray, flaking away in patches to reveal a darker green underneath. Evidence, I'd learn later, of at least one repaint sometime in the 60s. A canvas belt, brittle and cracked, still hung slack between the flywheel and a long-since-abandoned line shaft that used to run the length of the barn, driving a hammer mill that had ground feed corn for 3 generations of livestock. Sparrows had taken up residence in the rafters above it, and their droppings had built up in a pale, chalky crust along one edge of the engine's cooling fins, the kind of detail that tells you exactly how long a place has sat undisturbed by human hands reaching up to clean it. Opal came out to meet me in a housecoat and rubber boots, moving slower than her voice suggested she wanted to, and she watched me with the particular sharp attention of someone who has outlived most people who'd argue with her, and has grown comfortable simply observing instead. She didn't say much at first. She just watched me walk around the engine, hands in my jacket pockets, taking it in before I touched anything, the way I always do. I ran a fingertip along the edge of the flywheel, feeling the decades of grime built up in a texture almost like felt, and I crouched to study the fuel line where it entered the injector pump, noting the way it had been patched twice, in 2 different eras, with 2 different gauges of copper tubing. I could feel Opal deciding whether I was the kind of person who'd earn an explanation, or the kind who'd just start turning wrenches and miss the whole point of why she'd called. I asked Wendell to start it up for me before I did anything else, because there's no substitute for hearing a machine speak in its own voice before you go rearranging its insides. He primed the fuel, cracked the compression release, and gave the flywheel a hard heave with both hands, the old-fashioned way, no electric starter on a unit this age. It caught on the second pull, that heavy, unhurried thud of a big single-cylinder diesel finding its rhythm, a sound like a slow, deliberate heartbeat rather than the quick chatter of a modern engine. And the flywheel was indeed spinning the wrong direction, counterclockwise, when everything about the casting, the porting, and the fuel injection timing marks stamped into that block told me, unmistakably, that it had been engineered to spin clockwise. Now, I need you to sit with that fact for a moment, the way I sat with it standing in that shed, because it's stranger than it sounds. An engine's rotation isn't just a preference. It's baked into the design, the cam timing, the valve or port sequencing on a two-stroke like this one, the direction the oil splash system is meant to sling lubricant, sometimes even the pitch of a cooling fan. Running an engine backward isn't like driving a car in reverse. It's more like trying to read a book from back to front and somehow still following the plot. Most engines simply won't do it. They'll kick, buck, backfire, and stall. This one had apparently been doing it faithfully for the better part of 70 years, and somehow it worked. That word somehow became my whole obsession for the next several days, the kind of obsession that follows you home, that has you lying awake, running through possibilities instead of sleeping. Because a puzzle like this doesn't let go of you just because you've clocked out for the evening. I want to walk you through how a diesel engine actually decides which way it wants to spin, because the answer to this mystery lives entirely in that mechanical logic. And once you understand it, the family's story starts to look less like folklore and more like a very carefully hidden act of wartime ingenuity. On a two-stroke diesel like this one, rotation direction is largely determined by the position of the intake and exhaust ports relative to where the piston is on its power stroke, combined with the timing of fuel injection. Reverse that rotation, and normally the fuel would be injected at exactly the wrong moment, too early or too late, relative to where the piston actually is, and instead of a clean, controlled ignition, you'd get erratic detonation, or no ignition at all, or an engine that runs so roughly it shakes itself apart within minutes. Picture trying to clap in time with a song that's suddenly playing backward. Your hands know the rhythm, but the rhythm no longer matches what your hands are doing, and the result is chaos rather than music. For this engine to run backward smoothly enough to fool 3 generations of farmers into thinking it was simply how she'd always been, something fundamental about its internals had to have been deliberately altered to match that reversed rotation. Somebody at some point hadn't just accepted that this engine ran backward. Somebody had re-engineered it to run backward on purpose and done it well enough that it never gave itself away. I pulled the timing cover first, expecting corrosion, expecting the ordinary wear of decades, and instead found something that made me sit back on my heels in that cramped little shed with my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The camshaft gear had been remachined, not replaced, remachined. The original tooth profile ground away and a new one cut into the same blank, offset in a way that would only make sense if you wanted that shaft to time correctly against a crankshaft spinning the opposite direction from what the factory intended. This wasn't a repair. This was custom fabrication, done by hand, done with a precision that told me whoever had done it understood exactly what they were doing and why. I found initials stamped into the gear's hub, small enough that I nearly missed them under 70 years of grime, alongside a date, 1943. That date told me everything and nothing at once. 1943 sat right in the thick of the war, and I already had a hunch about what I was looking at. But I needed to confirm it before I said anything to Opal, because a hunch isn't a fact, and I wasn't going to hand a 90-year-old woman a piece of family history I hadn't earned the right to claim yet. I called an old friend of mine, a retired machinist named Dutch, who'd spent 40 years restoring wartime agricultural equipment, and I described what I'd found: the remachined cam gear, the date, the reversed rotation that somehow still ran clean. He didn't hesitate. He told me exactly what I suspected, but hadn't wanted to say out loud yet. During the war, precision replacement parts for civilian farm equipment had become nearly impossible to source. Foundries and machine shops that used to cast and cut parts for stationary farm engines had been converted almost entirely to military production. If your crankshaft cracked or your cam gear stripped or a bearing seized, You didn't call a dealer and order a replacement. You either found a scrap yard and scavenged something close enough to make work, or you found a machinist willing to improvise, usually working nights by lantern light, because his days were already spoken for by whatever war contract had taken over his shop's regular business. Dutch told me he'd heard stories, not many, but a few, passed down among old-timers in the restoration community, the kind of stories that get traded at swap meets and equipment shows, the way other people trade recipes, of farmers during the war who'd cannibalized parts from a different make and model of engine entirely, sometimes even from a machine built to spin the opposite direction, simply because it was the only compatible casting they could get their hands on. Rather than let a working farm sit idle without power for a grain mill or a water pump, some machinist somewhere would remachine the timing components to make an engine run backward on purpose, matching the borrowed parts rather than fighting them. It was slower, more expensive in labor, and required real skill, but it meant the farm kept running while every proper factory part in the country was being funneled toward the war effort, toward tanks and aircraft engines and the 1,000 other machines that mattered more officially than one family's water pump on a ridge in Ohio. Standing in that shed, looking at those stamped initials, I understood what I was looking at. Somebody, probably Opal's father, or a machinist he'd hired, had lost a critical component on this engine sometime in 1943, at the exact moment the whole country's industrial capacity had turned toward Europe and the Pacific. And rather than let his family's water pump and feed grinder go silent, he'd found a way to keep the whole system running using whatever he could get his hands on, even if it meant permanently reversing the direction the heart of the machine beat. I brought this to Opal, sitting on an overturned bucket beside her, the way you deliver news that belongs to somebody else's family, not your own discovery to claim credit for. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she told me something that filled in the last piece of the puzzle in a way I hadn't expected. She said her father had never talked about the war years on the farm, not really, except for one thing he repeated every single time that engine started up, every single time for the rest of his life. She runs backward because I wouldn't let her stop. Opal had always understood it as a kind of stubborn old man pride, a farmer's boast about keeping his equipment alive against the odds. She'd never once considered that it might be literally, mechanically true. That somewhere in 1943, with a critical part failed and no proper replacement to be had anywhere in the country, her father had made a choice to keep his family's farm powered by any means necessary, even if it meant permanently altering the fundamental direction his engine's heart would beat for the rest of its working life. That's the thing about the scars a machine carries. Sometimes they're just wear, the honest erosion of decades of use. Gaskets weeping, bearings wearing thin, paint fading under 70 summers of unfiltered sun. But sometimes a scar is a decision, frozen in metal, made by somebody under pressure we can barely imagine from the comfort of hindsight. This engine's reversed rotation wasn't a flaw, it was a signature, cut by a machinist's hand into a cam gear in the middle of a war, saying as clearly as any words could that this family's farm was not going to go dark no matter what the rest of the world was doing to itself. Once I understood what I was looking at, my whole approach to the restoration changed. I'd come out there expecting a straightforward job, clean the fuel system, freshen the rings, maybe true up a warped valve, standard work for an engine this age. But now every component I touched with the awareness that I wasn't just restoring a machine. I was preserving evidence of an act of resourcefulness that deserved to be understood, not accidentally erased by someone who didn't know what they were looking at. The block itself, once I got deeper into it, told its own layered history, the way these old single-cylinder engines always do, if you know how to read the wear patterns. The cylinder walls showed the honest cross-hatching of honing done properly, decades ago, but the wear pattern on one side was subtly different from what you'd expect on an engine running its factory-intended direction. A slightly different thrust pattern where the piston skirt contacted the wall, evidence, permanent and undeniable, of an engine that had spent its entire working life fighting its own original design and somehow thriving anyway. The oiling system gave me the biggest scare of the whole job, because on an engine like this, lubrication depends partly on the flywheel and crankshaft slinging oil to specific surfaces at specific moments in the rotation, and reversing that rotation should have meant certain critical surfaces went chronically under-lubricated for 70 years. I fully expected, when I finally pulled the crank, to find catastrophic wear, scoring maybe even a cracked journal from decades of insufficient lubrication in exactly the wrong spot. What I found instead nearly brought me to tears, and I don't say that lightly about a piece of cast iron. Whoever had done this remachining work back in 1943 hadn't just reversed the cam timing. They'd also modified the oil slinger on the crankshaft itself, reshaping the small scoop that flings lubricant up into the cylinder, angling it to compensate for the reversed rotation, ensuring the oil still found its way to the surfaces that needed it, even though the whole engine was spinning the opposite direction from what its original engineers intended. That's not the work of a farmer, improvising with a hacksaw and a prayer. That's the work of somebody who deeply, intimately understood how this engine breathed, lubricated itself, and stayed alive, and who cared enough to get every detail right, and not just the parts that would make it start, but the parts that would make it last. I found myself wondering, more than once during that job, whether Opal's father had known he was creating something that would still be running 3 generations later, or whether he'd simply been trying to survive one particular difficult year and had, almost by accident, built something built to outlast him by the better part of a century. I don't know that it matters which one is true. Both possibilities carry the same quiet dignity. The restoration work itself, once I understood what I was preserving, became less about correction and more about honoring. I didn't reverse the rotation back to factory original, though I could have. The block itself would have accepted a proper cam gear and crankshaft, and there's a version of this job where a mechanic with less patience or less curiosity would have fixed what looked on the surface like an obvious error. But that reversed rotation wasn't an error. It was the whole point. It was the one physical fact in this entire farm that proved a specific, difficult year had actually happened, that a specific man had made a specific choice under pressure, and that his choice had outlived him by 70 years and counting. Instead, I rebuilt the engine to run exactly the way it had been running, backward, deliberately, faithfully, but properly this time, with fresh bearings, a clean fuel system, new rings honed to match that original, reversed thrust pattern rather than fighting it. I cleaned 70 years of grime off that stamped hub without removing the initials or the date, because those 2 lines of hand-cut numbers were, in every way that mattered, the most important part on that entire engine. The morning I finally got it running clean again, Opal came out to watch, same as she had that very first day, still moving slower than her voice suggested she wanted to, still watching with that same sharp, patient attention. I primed the fuel, cracked the compression release, the way Wendell had shown me his grandfather always did, and gave that flywheel a hard heave. It caught on the first pull this time, that same heavy, unhurried thud, that same deliberate backward heartbeat that had kept this farm's water pumping and its feed grinding for 70 straight years, without a single person besides one long-dead machinist ever fully understanding why. Opal stood there with one hand resting lightly on the engine's warm cast-iron flank, feeling that reversed rhythm hum up through her palm, and she said something I've carried with me ever since. She said her father used to tell her that a machine only breaks the rules when the rules have already broken the machine's chance to keep going the normal way, and that the measure of a good mechanic isn't whether you can make something run the way the book says it should, but whether you can make it run at all, for as long as somebody needs it to, using whatever you've got in front of you. I think about that farm more often than I probably should, the way I think about every machine that's taught me something I didn't expect to learn. I've spent my career learning to read metal the way other people read handwriting, the scars, the wear patterns, the small deviations from factory spec that tell you a machine has a history worth respecting rather than correcting. But that reversed engine taught me something sharper than most. It taught me that sometimes the thing that looks like a flaw, the thing 3 generations dismissed with an offhand warning about standing clear of the flywheel, is actually the truest, most honest record left behind of a person who refused to let hardship win, even when winning meant doing everything backward and making it work anyway. There's a particular kind of humility that comes from spending a week convinced you're looking at a defect, only to discover you're actually looking at the single most impressive piece of engineering on the whole farm. I've rebuilt engines that ran clockwise their entire working lives without a single hiccup, and not one of them ever taught me as much as this one did by simply refusing to spin the way the factory intended. It reminded me that the measure of good work isn't always following the manual. Sometimes it's understanding the manual well enough to know exactly which rules you can safely break, and having the nerve to break them cleanly the way a surgeon might, rather than carelessly the way a vandal would. That engine is still running today, still spinning the wrong direction on purpose, still keeping a promise made in the middle of a war by a man none of us ever met, but all of us, in that shed, understood completely. And every time somebody hears that heavy, unhurried thud carry across the pasture, I hope they think, even just for a second, about how much determination it takes to keep something alive by any means necessary, backward or otherwise, and how a machine like that deserves to be remembered exactly as it was built to survive. Not fixed, not corrected, just understood, finally for what it always was.